Hello, once again, everybody. We are so excited to be back chatting about movies with you yet again. My name is Devora Governale.
And I'm Carrie Parker.
Today, we actually thought we'd talk about 3 films that were extremely influential and important to us each as an individual. So I'm going to kick it over to Carrie and let her get us jump started with that.
The very first movie that made me love movies and just absolutely blew my mind was The Usual Suspects. And I was probably 11 at the time. That sounds crazy. 11 or 12. Just because of what the movie is rated, but I swear my parents are real good at this stuff, guys. I'm not getting my parents in trouble. It came out in 1995, so I was about 12, so I was probably about close to 13. Yeah, that makes sense when I saw it, because I feel like as a military brat, I keep time by location. So I feel like I saw The Usual Suspects when we lived in Niceville, Florida. So that's why I'm like, I left before I was 13. So the math checks out. It works. But so the reason why is that on the outside, it looks like your basic 90s crime mobbish action movie, right? And you're just like, this is fine. You're going into it. And the storytelling process is the detective interviewing one of the suspects after an event's occurred. And so everything is pretty much done in flashback, right? The narrative style is that the suspect's telling us this story. That storytelling style, to me, always makes me think biblical. Because the way my dad explained the Bible that finally made the Bible click was that all of the different books were all of the different disciples' points of view of these events. And it's their version of the story. And I was like, oh my God, Dad, that makes so much more sense. 12 men will never agree on the same thing. Like 12 men will always correct each other on what exactly went down. It's Chaz Palminteri, amazing role as the detective, and it's Kevin Spacey. And I know that we have a bit of a struggle with Kevin Spacey right now, because as it turns out, was not a great person behind the scenes, but was this renowned actor for close to a couple decades. And this was what really made him land. Everyone took notice. We now understood who Kevin Spacey was as far as a talent. And it was set in stone. And so I love that movie because the writing, the direction, everything came together. And I was so deep in it. And then my little tiny brain just went, what? At the plot twist, because I am a plot twist kid. If I can see the ending coming, I am so upset and I get so bored and I will literally stop paying attention. So my next one, hilariously around a similar time frame, is Legends of the Fall. Ironically, again, I saw it when I was about 12. So I'm not outing anything about my parents, just the fact that they were really cool. I think it's really cool. But I mean, my dad is a movie person, my stepdad, to be clear, and that's been a pretty big way that we connect. And so maybe that is exactly why I am who I am. And because I was allowed to watch this stuff. But I wasn't allowed to watch Braveheart. Weirdest juxtaposition, by the way. I've seen Legends of the Fall, but I've never seen Braveheart. Don't get me started. Maybe someday we'll watch it together.
We watched that. I feel like we watched Dances with Werewolves. If it
wolves
history, my parents were like, "Yep, we're watching this." If it was really dripping in history from World War II, especially specifically the Holocaust, oh my gosh, we were. I was watching Holocaust films at 12 that definitely disturbed me to no end. But, it was also, I then was also shocked a couple of years later when we did those focus in social studies, and I had peers that literally didn't believe that it happened. And I was just sitting there going, I have a grandmother who fought Nazis when she was the age we are now. I had family that died in concentration camps. How can you not believe this happened? So again, all of that to say, no judgment zone for your parents. We're just very like, if it was history, if it was culture, then we were going to watch it, even if it was not age appropriate.
Henry Thomas is the boy from E.T. So when I was even younger and I watched E.T., it was the same boy, and now we've both aged and grown, and he's an adult already in a movie. And so it was very interesting to look at it that way, and also just that reality of growing with actors who, by the way, I adore Henry Thomas at the same time. And maybe this is why, but at the same time, I also believe it's because he's genuinely talented, because that's the only way he would be here, you know? He really is good. I love that he's been in the Mike Flanagan series lately. So that's a fun, sentimental throwback. But this was the first time I remember seeing him since E.T., and my heart absolutely shattered when his character died. Like, absolutely, because the whole entire family. And so the fact that I'm 12 and I'm watching this, and I'm like, Anthony Hopkins' character has a stroke, and so he starts using a chalkboard to talk, and I'm 12 and like crying about how this man, it was the Odin and Thor thing before Odin and Thor were a thing, you know what I mean? And it was Brad Pitt and Aidan Quinn and Henry Thomas, and I then, when Practical Magic came out, I already knew who Aidan Quinn was, and I was like, I love him! I'm so excited about this, right? So I was a movie nerd by then. It had already been established, and that's who I was, and it's because of these moments that made me connect to being human. That was probably the first movie that made me think existentially, right? Because it showed the whole entire journey of these brothers through that time span, all the way to, it's one of those movies that shows the end of someone's life as well, and not just the journey that you went through for that main storytelling process. And so I really appreciated that storytelling process, and I would like refer back to it as I was learning more storytelling concepts, tools, and narratives. And so that was number 2. The last one, which is another one, ironically, that you mentioned that I introduced to you or made you watch, but Amelie. So Amelie kind of hits a couple markers for me. It is probably in my top 3 movies ever made list, like hands down beautiful filmmaking, like hits almost all the marks, if not all of them. It's literally gorgeous visually, but it's also, the score has persevered as one of these amazing albums or soundtracks, and it's a lot of piano, and so the pianist who did it is famous, and that's been part of what's considered his collection is this movie. So for me, it was just all of that. Again, the storytelling process is Amelie as a child, and the way that it introduces us to all of the characters or players in her world is pretty consistent, and it's adorable because it's stylized like that, right? They made a choice and then they copied it everywhere throughout her story. But that's kind of, I think, why Amelie hits so well as a story that perseveres. It's about a girl, but it's also about a boy, and they identify that in her counterpart, and that they both had childhoods until they got to this point. And so I think bigger picture existentially, the reason I like it is that it addresses the inner child concept. That yes, we can be adults, but we are still that kid because those are the events and steps that made us grow and learn in the order that we learned, right? Because we experience things based on the events going on around us. So the death of her mother and then her dad, dealing with that and kind of becoming a recluse, and so she does the roaming gnome concepts and takes the garden gnome that was on the shrine to the mom, sends it around the world, and with a stewardess friend, and the stewardess friend sends back photos of the gnome to the dad, and the dad is like, what the hell is going on here? Like, how, why, who would go to this length? And Amelie just plays dumb, like she has no clue what's going on, and it's adorable and precious. But so she does that. She chooses to be the catalyst for change in a positive way in people around her's life, right? With no other real intention or motivation other than allowing people to experience that catalyst, right? Because we all deserve to be a main character. We all deserve to have that story and have that resolution, be able to move on to our next storybook or chapter, what have you. And it is really fairy tale-esque, and I do kind of have a soft spot for modern fairy tale storytelling. So that's definitely why I think it hit. But also just the production design, the red greens, how they balanced so well in that movie, but they were used so wisely. And that's actually a pretty common aesthetic for the director, because I, of course, then spiraled and went and had to watch all of their movies. Jean-Pierre Jeunet. I'm not French, and I'm going to butcher that. But yes, so I love that too, when you find movies where the aesthetic just speaks to you, and then you're like, I love the way your brain looks at the world, and you look back to see, like, are all of your movies like that? Do they all look like they came out of your brain, or were some of them, like, dictated by the production studio? You know what I mean? Like, you feel that a lot of times, that differentiation, but, and that's why later we'll talk about Guillermo del Toro and how amen, same about his brain. It's like, I love how every single movie of his, it's his world. We are diving into his brain, but I absolutely love it. So those are my three.
I love it. They all sound, very, very Carrie.
Yes, that made me the most chaotic creature that I am today.
And hopefully that's what we're doing here, is helping inspire people to want to watch more movies.
Yay! Go watch these movies.
Yay. All right. Well, I've got my three. So the first one that I'm going to very briefly chat about is actually Cool Runnings. That was the first movie that I can remember that starting to become like teen, when people would say, what's your favorite movie? I started to just always say Cool Runnings, and I really meant it. One of the reasons was that I was a pretty big nerd for the Olympics. There was something about the Olympics that made me feel like you were seeing the humans on this planet that were the closest to actual superheroes. They were the people who had pushed the hardest and trained the most and were literally at the top of the top. And could do the most physically for whatever their competition was. And I just had so much respect for that and thought that was so cool. And then also there was something about the Olympics to me that I thought was so beautiful, because it literally brought the world together. Like, watching the opening ceremonies, you'd have all of these countries from all over the planet, and they'd all come together. But the idea, and the fact that it was a tradition we've had in the world for so long, that it was something that we kept going. The idea that could be a tradition that could just keep going and going and going. So the Olympics was one part of it, but I also just really loved being able to learn this story of these real life gentlemen that were real life underdogs and pushed themselves to not just be trailblazers, but to push against all these stereotypes. And that it seemed as though no matter how much people pushed them down and no matter how much people told them, you're ridiculous, you can't do this, no matter how many times they were laughed at, they just kept pushing. And I think that probably one of the most powerful parts of that story to me is that in a more like American cliche underdog story, they're the ones that come and they win the competition and they walk home with the trophy and they become the best at the end. But in their story, they didn't win at the end. Not the trophy. They didn't win the gold medal. In the end, their car had a malfunction and they literally almost died. Like, to this day, I cannot watch that movie without just completely bawling, because that was another thing. As a filmmaking tool, you were of course seeing the fictionalized version being played by actors, but as you got into the ending, the climactic sequence of the film, they did incorporate actual footage from the Olympics. So there are a few moments there in the end where you are seeing the real guys in that crash and it's not the actors. And whenever I watch that crash, I lose it every time, because when you look at it, it looks like there's no way they should have physically been able to survive that crash. It looks like all of their necks should have broken. And the fact that they are able to stand and walk away from that, and that instead of it being a victory of a trophy or a medal, it became a trophy of when you get knocked down, you get back up again. And I think that was just so inspiring to me in life. I love that also in Captain Marvel. They've got a great little montage with her being knocked down and getting back up again. And I think that is just so true to life. We're just constantly knocked down. Life is hard and we go through hard things. And I believe that it doesn't feel good, but it is a good thing that it happens. It's an important thing that it happens. Otherwise, we don't get stronger and we don't learn and we don't gain knowledge and wisdom and we don't become more patient, and we just will never become a more awesome version of ourselves without going through hard things. But to have it portrayed in that storytelling way was so impactful for me as a young girl, to see these 4 grown men go through something so hard. They start out the beginning of the film being knocked down. They don't get to run. They don't get to be in the event they want. So they just keep going. And then to get to the end of the film and they get knocked down again. But they still make it a victory where he says, we're going to cross that finish line. I am going to get across that. And they all get up and they carry their sled across the finish line. And I just think that will always be a great inspiration for anyone who's just needing a reminder that life is tough, but you can get back up and you can turn most things into a victory in some way, shape, or form. Maybe it'll take some time. Maybe it can't happen immediately. Maybe it's not a matter of just standing up with your sled. Maybe it's just continuing on. And then when you're able to reflect on how that event helped you to surpass something later, it's not always going to be instant, but most of the time we can take a hard event in our life and eventually turn it into a victory. So I just loved that so much. So yeah, literally until 1999 when The Matrix came out, if anyone asked me what was your favorite film, it was Cool Runnings. But when Matrix came out, then I had many years of The Matrix as my favorite movie, which own way as well, groundbreaking in cinematography and filmmaking techniques and everything. And now when people ask me that question, I don't even know what to answer. There's just been so many films, and I'm a person who tends to love films from most genres. I prided myself when we were in college that I wasn't just a chick flick kind of girl. Don't get me wrong. I love a good 2000s rom-com. Legally Blonde and Mean Girls, like, don't get me wrong, I love those films, but I often would pick up action film over a girly film most days, especially now today. But yeah, so Cool Runnings, love it so much. Definitely a life-altering film for me at that time. Okay, number 2, which technically is 1 year older than Cool Runnings, and that film is Batman Returns. And the reason why Batman Returns is on my list, again, I loved Michael Keaton. I thought he was a great Batman. I was really glad he came back to reprise it recently. I loved Danny DeVito. He was so funny to me, and having him as the Penguin, they did such a great job. But really, the reason why it was that film was Michelle Pfeiffer as Catwoman.
Yes.
And
Yes, babe. Validated.
yes, that film came around the first time that I had a cat as a pet. And most people who know me would know I am a crazy cat lady. I have more cats than I should, and I love them. They are my fur babies. But so part of it was the fact that she was a cat, but also it was the way that she did that character. The fact that she started out so meek and just so weak, even. You know, you've got Christopher Walken, who's such a great villain, and he's a great villain because he feels a little too true to life, even though it's a very characterized world that Tim Burton creates and it's very comic book feeling. Christopher Walken is a little too true to life villain in that. You know, Penguin is way over the top and crazy.
I think you're absolutely right. And honestly, I feel like this is the Christopher Walken conversation, just like there's the Tim Curry conversation. Yeah. The other one for me is Willem Dafoe, but what movie when you think this person, what movie do you think of? And honestly, that was the first movie where I experienced Christopher Walken, but he has had so many, but he's just such a presence. He has such a unique look, but like you said, he plays villain well, but at the same time, he's so popular, he's so well liked. We all feel very secure in the fact that Christopher Walken is not actually a villain in real life. He was not typecast. You know what I mean? He has that charisma where you're like, oh, he might murder some people for some money. Like, okay, I'm not mad about it though. Let's see where this goes. Like, he can pull that off.
Yeah. Well, and he's being a lot of things that are villains in our world today, you know, manipulating people, shredding documents, being a certain person on camera and then another person behind the scenes. I mean, like, he's scary in that he's kind of real. He kind of exists. And, you know, of course, he is the main villain up against Catwoman because she's his secretary in the beginning. And, you know, she's just serving everybody coffee in the boardroom and no one can come up with the solution to the problem they're tackling in this meeting. And she, you know, kind of weakly raises her hand, is like, I have an idea, and then immediately like shrinks backwards, you know, to see her go from that version of Selena Kyle. And then after she's killed by Christopher Walken and literally resurrected by cats, which, oh my gosh, I know that is kind of crazy, but I like that scene was like, yeah, the cat saved her and brought her back. And then that whole sequence that occurs after that, you know, she gets home. We kind of see a repeat of what we already established with her character earlier in the film of I'm coming home, I'm saying hi to my cat, I'm turning on my lights, I'm eating my dinner. We're seeing that sequence repeated, but now she's, you know, basically just recently brought back from the dead. It like blew my mind that the production designer had this neon sign on her wall that said hello there, and she smashed out 2 letters so it said hell here. The fact that the designer also just like every surface was painted pink, and she had dolls and fluffies and like a dollhouse and like so many like girly young things. And to have this whole scene, which it had to be a one-take wonder because I cannot even imagine the nightmare of having to reset that. But they let her go to town on it. She just smashed things. I'm not sure why she had black spray paint in her closet, but she pulls that out and like graffiti's all over her own property. She's throwing the dolls into the garbage disposal, and just the visual symbolism that was given of destroying the innocence of her youth. I just remember even at a young age just thinking how powerful it was that you could, for me as a person who was essentially destined to go into creating the visual elements of storytelling, that was one of those initial moments that kind of woke that up in me. And then, of course, she goes from destroying her apartment to taking her leather jacket and cutting that thing up into pieces, and you're just seeing her angrily sewing on the sewing machine. And I had been hand sewing at that point for probably 5 years, and I was in my very first stages of machine sewing. So when her silhouette comes into frame in that window and she's in her costume, you see her like try on all the things. She tries on the claws. She's making the ears. But when it's finally all done and she puts it on and her silhouette comes into the frame of her window, I swear to you, I was a changed human from that entire sequence as a young girl. I swear.
Same, girl. And the reason I was holding my hand up, the idea that this was Tim Burton, babe, that's what I think when we talk about allies, right, in feminism, and there are men out there who act like they're feminists, the idea that Tim Burton did this in the 90s, right, and is making this statement and showing the visual as you literally describe it. He created a metaphorical visual of her having her feminist awakening because she was playing the role. She was the good girl. She was the secretary. She got all the coffee. She said all the right words, and she wore her heels and her makeup and her skirt, and she did the thing. The very like 50s concept of who women were supposed to be. And Mad Men, right? All the references back to her realizing that men will treat her like she is nothing. They do not value her. They do not think that she holds a worth or value, and she is expendable. And that realization, which unfortunately, girl, is it's such a female feeling. Like, it's unfortunate to say as a human, but every single girl has hit a point, and that's what they are representing, and then why we feel that connection to it, because it wasn't said. She didn't sit there and go on a Shakespearean monologue about feminism or her disillusionment with the patriarchy now, but just simply a F this shit. You know what I'm saying? Like, she was like, nope, I'm done. I'm not letting a man do that to me ever again. And that is such a female-centric feeling, unfortunately. There are other people who experience it, but the reality is being born a girl means you're gonna feel that at some point in your life is, I am never letting a man do blank to me again. And she was
throw me out a window to my death again.
Right, treat me like I'm nothing.
Yeah, there are things in life where that is the metaphor, where you feel like you've been thrown out a window to your death. And I feel like Greta did a great job of taking that scene and then doing a whole film of it with the Barbie movie, and that's a whole other episode. But,
right. Yes. Amen.
Yeah.
But yes. And that's probably what Barbie movie is for the newer generation, is our Michelle Pfeiffer's Catwoman, and we are like, oh shit, we're allowed to be hot and not be nice to men? What? Like, who said? No.
Instead of just one scene in a film.
But yes, that idea of we don't owe men our sexuality or anything else, our power, and that we should be able to be equals and partner with them. And that is genuinely how we make progress in this world.
For me, as I was thinking about, the three movies, because again, like I said, at that era, I could tell you my favorite movie was Cool Runnings, and a few years later, I could tell you it was Matrix, and now it's hard to do that. When I think about Batman Returns, I naturally start to think about, I really have loved the superhero genre my whole life. I grew up watching the X-Men cartoons as a kid. I definitely grew up with my dad showing us all of the Christopher Reeves Superman films and the older Supergirl. I wanted so much to be as brave as Lois Lane. I wanted so much to be as strong as Cora L, Supergirl. But then to get into Batman, it was like, yeah. And that's why it was hard when some of the next chapters came out, the films that were after this one, but before Dark Knight, where there was just a lot of criticism. But I still, to this day, honestly love seeing Jim Carrey as the Riddler. And I loved seeing Arnold Schwarzenegger as Mr. Freeze, and I loved that we got Batman, or that we got Robin, and that we got Batgirl, and so I know that not a lot of people love them, but I loved that superhero genre. And then, of course, by the time we hit 2000, man, it's why I love that you're wearing the X-Men shirt, because I will say that the first X-Men film was a very close. I was close to replacing Batman Returns with the first X-Men, especially because, like I said earlier, that film opens with a scene in a concentration camp and Magneto's powers kind of coming in for the first time as that metal gate is bent as he is being ripped from his family. And because I grew up with stories, like I said, of my more literally fighting the Nazis in Denmark, and my family members who had been sent to concentration camps, and there were only 2 family members that survived, that film was so powerful to me that it opened like that you could start something that was fictional about superheroes, but it starts in something so real and so gritty, and something that was so real for me being raised on those stories. And then even when we get into the superhero realm of it, you're still talking about a very relatable universal issue of the other, and how do you respond to being treated like the other, and how well that can represent so many different ways of feeling like other. They even make a joke of, I hate this costume. He's like, well, what would you rather be in, yellow and blue spandex? Which, of course, by the time we get Deadpool and Wolverine, we actually did finally get our yellow and blue spandex on Hugh Jackman. Yes. At the time in 2000, that was the costume choice that was appropriate for where we were at culturally to receive that superhero film. So yeah, I did have some others that came close to winning out, and X-Men 2 and X-Men First Class. I just, like, all of those films did a lot for me as a human. I loved those so much. I even loved Wolverine X-Men Origins. I know that one is usually like low on the Rotten Tomatoes, but I know Silver Fox is a villain in the comics, and she's a villain at the end of the movie. I know that, but who she's portrayed as the whole rest of the film, I connected with who she was as a character so much at that chapter of my life. Yeah, but still, even with all of those very close contenders, Batman Returns still wins out all of them. Okay, number 3, and I'm planning to keep this one succinct, mostly because we want to do a full episode on it in the near future. But of course, Pixar, if this is going to be a Pixar film. And of course, Pixar had a lot of films that spoke to me. When Monsters, Inc. came out, which was one of their early ones, I didn't know yet what I learned later in life. I was sure I was going to have a little girl just like Boo. Just the storytelling elements of that were mind-blowing to me. Watching the way that the art form of that computer animation grew. By the time you got to Incredibles 2, I think, we were seeing like water that looked like, holy crap, that could have been filmed. You know, there were a lot of Pixar films that were really formative for me. Even some of the older ones, honestly, like Inside Out was huge for me. That one, it still will kill me anytime. I just think, like the Olympics, so incredible in the way that it is a very universal thing, that we are all humans with emotions, and we're all trying to figure out how to process them. We're all figuring out how to make it through our stages of development. And so just the universality of that to me in that storytelling, and giving, again, the visual storytelling element with these characters, so huge. Coco has become one of the films that today has replaced Matrix. When you ask me what one of my favorite films is, it is easily top 5. And ironically, now that I'm hitting this stage of life, Cars 3 is one that I connect to a lot, because it talks a lot about, entering that next chapter of life and passing on what you have to the next generations and things. But the one Pixar film that definitely caused me to feel the most seen by Pixar was Up. And I'm going to cry again. Sorry.
Oh, babe.
No way to tell this story without crying. But at that point, I had been married, I want to say 4 years, 3 years, somewhere in that range. And we had not been able to have children yet. And so we were starting to hit that chapter of like, oh, something's definitely wrong. They tell you the first year or two, that's not necessarily uncommon, but we were hitting the phase where it was like, okay, something is wrong. And so that day I went to go to the doctor to get test results, and did find out there was things wrong with my body. And we've had such a journey since then, and we'll definitely discuss that in our episode. But I had a couple of gal pals. They had been teens in the youth group that I volunteered in a youth group. I did a lot of that, which I will also talk a lot about in that episode, and how that did a lot to help me process through a lot of this. But went to the doctor, got the results, found out unable to bring children into this world. And it was, a very devastating shift in reality to need to start to face, because that's what it was needing to process through a shift in reality. And so my two gal pals were like, we know what you love. We know what you need. Let's go to the movies. And Up had just come out. So I went from this.
Oh, dear goodness, babe.
With the doctor explaining this to me, and the opening montage of that film, of course, was very painful, but I don't know if I've ever felt more seen by a group of filmmakers than I did in that moment, where I just received this news and then seeing this montage, and the fact that that Pixar was willing to put that out in the world, so that anybody who had that experience, was having that experience like I was, and was going to have that experience, would also hopefully be able to feel seen. And when you get through, of course, you lose her at the end of that montage. And I connected with Ellie a lot because she's very loud and she's very aggressive. She's very in his face, which is very much who I am. But then we lose her by the end of the montage. So she's actually a character that's hardly in the film. And yet I felt more seen than ever. But then again, when we get to be at the end of the film where he opens the adventure book, and she thanks him for all the adventures that they had throughout life. In their montage where they're constantly having to break that jar of money so they don't get to go after their dream trip. As a person who chose to be a starving artist as her career, wow, I connect that. And while theater is not literally the zoo, which is where they worked as their career, my heavens, working in theater does feel like working at a zoo.
Girl.
Visual storytelling element.
Yes.
I felt like there was my life up on the screen, and they shot it in a, got it down to this scene that was probably only 4 or 5 minutes. But there it was like Pixar had taken my whole life and put it up there. And what's even better is that film is now, oh, holy cannoli, 16, 17 years old. I mean, it's been out for well over a decade. We're starting, I think, to lean closer to 2 decades with that film. And I feel like with every rewatch, that always just feels more and more true. And the fact that Pixar could do that, could know me without knowing me. And at the time, we were working at movie theaters in addition to live theaters, which brought us to our passion of wanting to get Maven open. And so that film was very instrumental in really showing me that film can do that. Not just for me on that day when I got that news and saw that scene, but film, this art form that's been out there for over a century, that gets to be true for anybody. It's why we called it Maven, because it's that idea that there are films out there for everyone, and that you are the expert in what those films are and that are meaningful and important and special to you. There are movies that have saved people's lives. There are movies that have helped people to process trauma. There are movies that have helped people to reset emotions they're needing to, and that's what Up did for me, is it really showed me how important and crucial that this art form is to the world. That it's not just entertainment. Sometimes it is entertainment. We've talked about the empty calorie entertainment, and there's things out there that are just fluff, and there are things out there that are great. But that films can be that. That film really showed that to me. Okay, I have talked and cried for way too long, but there are my three.
Yay! Girl. So yes, we'll do Up. We'll have some conversations because that one hits home for both of us in different ways, and we'll talk about that and what it is to be a female and how being able to reproduce affects our identity and how we perceive ourselves, and the grief sometimes that goes with that realization that we might not be able to reproduce, or who are we if we can't have children, and how it's big. It's a big part of being human, right? And so it's not easy when one of those things that you're told is part of your existence doesn't work out the way everyone told us it would, and all of the stories, right?